the idea of freedom of speech is under attack, causing it to be more difficult to share our faith.
Yes.
And is there a place where, as Christians, we look back 20 years, 30 years, even longer, and say, you know what, we really made some mistakes taking advantage of the power structure that we had in in society, where if somebody wanted to do something outside of what the church found good, it was going to be a big problem. And whether it's boycotts or being thrown in jail for having views that aren't approved by the church, that was way more common hundreds of years ago than recently. But how do we as Christians, how should we behave when we do have a more of a power, ownership of power, so that when things change, we aren't immediately shot down? Because I think we are now, oh, you're a Christian, you had your chance type thing. And I think you mentioned it earlier, grace, I think, is one of those important things, respect. But can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's okay. So let's use porn, for example. In the past, porn was banned, or at least anything, but it depends what they defined. There's a threshold here, but the threshold, let's say 50 years ago, was drastically lower than the threshold today as to what's legal. So there was what's legal 50 years ago, there's what's legal today. Huge difference. So in the past, a more conservative society said, okay, we're going to censor anything above this threshold. That is flat out illegal. You get arrested, whatever. So how do you handle that? That's a good question. But also, how much should you restrict? Let's say if I suddenly found myself, often today I'll see some lame thing the government does, and I think, well, what if I was dictator of this country? What would I do? And that's not an easy question, because the immediate temptation is, okay, here's the rules. This is going to be allowed. This is not going to be allowed. But then I think about what God allows in this world. And I think, whoa, like God gives us moral rules, but he also allows people freedom to decide whether they're not going to live by those moral rules. But he also gives us the government to enforce God's moral rules, is what it says in Romans chapter 13. But what happens when the government goes rogue? What if the government doesn't feel they need to follow God anymore, that they need to even incorporate Judeo-Christian values, and they make up their own rules? Let's say, like in North Korea, for example, or some of the draconian rules that the Communist Party of China is now implementing for COVID restraint, that people in Shanghai are just saying, this is unbearable. So I don't know, Sheldon. It is tough to say. On the one hand, it's if you're the government, you have to have rules, but God's plan for government is that those rules are actually correspond to moral reality. And the problem comes when the government moves further and further away from God's moral reality and starts making up its own reality. Then it starts crossing the moral line. And then you start having a moral obligation to say, no, this is wrong, not even abiding by that. But even how you abide, how you confront, like, for example, I have worked in the past in certain communist regimes. I have been there. I've talked about Jesus Christ. I've done things that were flat out illegal, let's say in the USSR or Cuba or whatever. But I was morally obligated. I felt I'm morally obligated to defy the law in this case, to set aside the law because it's morally wrong. So, but I don't have to do it in a way that's in the government's face. And the Christians in those countries, if you did it in a way that is in their face, in the face of the government, you just simply got the hammer-fisted handling of the government. You were destroyed, cut down, executed, whatever. and you were destroyed. So somehow Christianity has to learn how to function in a society where the government's rules digress from what's morally right, but yet in a way that they accomplish our mission as Christians, that is to prepare to meet God and help others do the same, while at the same time surviving in a society where there is no freedom of travel, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly. So then you have to figure out how we're going to function and carry out the mission in that situation.